Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into a name that is, well, it's pretty much synonymous with impossible ambition, Alexander the Great.
It's a story so profound, so laced with myth, that the historical facts, they often struggle to compete with the legend itself.
We are speaking, of course, about Alexander III of Macedon, and the figures, the stats attached to his life, are almost unbelievable.
I mean, think about it, undefeated in battle. A military commander whose strategies, even now, over 2 millennia later, are still part of the curriculum in military academies.
And he did it all so quickly. By the time he was just 30 years old, he had forged the largest empire the world had ever seen.
An empire stretching from the borders of Greece all the way east, right to the threshold of India. It's staggering.
And it's the sheer weight of his accomplishment, I think, that's so hard to grasp. When his brief life ended at age 32, he wasn't just some regional king.
Oh, not even close. He's the king of Macedon, yes, but he was also the hegemon of the Hellenic League.
Which is essentially the supreme military commander of all Greece, the strategos autocrator.
Exactly. Then you add Pharaoh of Egypt.
And of course, the big one, king of Persia, because he had fully dismantled the vast Achaemenid Empire.
It's a portfolio, an administrative and martial portfolio that suggests a lifetime of effort, not just 12 years of campaigning.
So for this deep dive, our source material is a pretty comprehensive stack of historical accounts, right?
It is, but it's primarily drawn from later secondary historians, people like Arrian and Plutarch.
And that's a key point, isn't it? Because those authors relied heavily on primary accounts written by Alexander's own generals, men like Ptolemy and Nearchus, and those original texts are now lost.
Completely lost. So we have this necessary layer of complexity.
Right. We're often seeing the events through the biased eyes of the very men who ended up carving his empire into pieces for themselves.
Exactly. So our mission today is to sift through those layers, to understand not just the timeline of his conquests, which are incredible, of course, but the core of the political and military genius that drove him.
And the complex, often contradictory personal character that, ultimately led to his downfall.
Precisely. And just as critical is understanding the profound cultural impact. Alexander's conquests weren't just about shifting borders on a map.
No.
They sparked the entire era of cultural diffusion and syncretism that we now call the Hellenistic period.
We're talking about the genesis of whole new cultural blends, things like Hellenistic Judaism and Greco-Buddhism.
Yeah, where Greek philosophy and art just permeated the ancient world for centuries after he was gone. That massive cultural wave is perhaps his most lasting, yet probably unintended legacy.
Okay, let's unpack this monumental figure, and the only place to start is at the very beginning.
His birth in Pella.
Alexander III was born in Pella, the capital of Macedon, around 356 BC. Now, the exact date might be a bit uncertain. Sources put it around the 20th or 21st of July.
But the certain facts, the facts of his lineage, are what really set the stage for everything that came after.
His parentage was politically charged from the absolute start.
Well, completely. His father was Philip II, the brilliant, but let's be honest, often brutal king of Macedon from the Argead dynasty.
And his mother was the fiery and intensely ambitious Olympias, daughter of the Eneisid king of Epirus.
And that maternal heritage gave Alexander a non-Macedonian element, which, as we'll definitely see, became a major point of political contention later on in his life.
And right from his birth, this concept of a divine or at least a superhuman destiny was heavily cultivated.
It was pure propaganda, but it was brilliant. The stories surrounding his arrival served a crucial purpose: to elevate him above all the political squabbles of the Macedonian court.
And the sources are really rich here.
They are. We hear about Olympias's vivid dream, for instance, that her womb was struck by a thunderbolt.
Right, which led to this massive, far-spreading fire.
And Philip, on the other hand, dreamed he sealed her womb with the image of a lion. These were immediately interpreted by priests as signs that Alexander was destined to rule vast territories.
It even suggested that Zeus himself might be his biological father.
Which would, cement his divine link right from the get-go.
We also have the story of the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the ancient seven wonders.
Which supposedly burned down the very night he was born.
And this led the historian Hegesias to claim that the goddess of the hunt and childbirth was simply too preoccupied attending to Alexander's birth to protect her own temple.
What's fascinating is how these legends provided such a convenient and powerful narrative, especially once Alexander began his massive campaigns. It's not just happenstance.
No, it feels very deliberate.
Alexander himself, or at least his historians, clearly encouraged and amplified these myths to solidify this notion that his destiny transcended human politics. He was positioning himself not merely as a king, but as a force of nature.
Shifting to his upbringing, he was raised initially by his nurse, Lanique.
And her brother, Clytus the Black, would later save Alexander's life, only to, well, we'll get to that tragic story.
He was initially taught by a strict relative, Leonidas, learning all the standard noble Macedonian skills: writing, fighting, hunting, reading, playing the lyre.
But the pivotal moment, the moment that really illustrates his unique insight, came when he was just 10 years old, with the horse Bucephalus.
Right. Philip was offered this massive, beautiful, but completely unruly Thessalian horse.
And nobody could ride it. It bucked and charged constantly. It was considered untamable.
Alexander just stood there watching, and instead of reacting to the horse's aggression, he observed its fear.
He realized the horse was terrified of its own moving shadow. A 10-year-old figured that out.
So he simply turned the horse toward the sun, which made the shadow disappear behind it, and tamed it instantly. It was this incredible display of perception, of reading a psychological state and solving a problem in a completely non-obvious way.
And this was not lost on Philip. The sources describe Philip as being so moved, some even say tearful, that he exclaimed, "My boy, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedon is too small for you."
That one moment effectively stamped Alexander's entire trajectory with Philip's full and emotional endorsement.
It really did.
And his education just continued to be exceptional. At age 13, Philip chose Aristotle.
I mean, arguably the most influential mind in the Western world, to be his personal tutor.
And Aristotle didn't just teach Alexander, he tutored a whole group of young Macedonian nobles.
Yes, the future generation of his generals. People like Ptolemy, Hephaestion, and Cassander. They were all taught together at the Temple of the Nymphs at Mieza.
And the terms of this tutoring arrangement, they reveal Philip's political brilliance.
Oh, absolutely. In exchange for teaching his son, Philip agreed to rebuild Aristotle's hometown of Stagira, which Philip himself had previously destroyed.
And he freed all its citizens who had been enslaved or exiled. It was a perfect blend of high culture and strategic statesmanship.
It was. And under Aristotle, Alexander developed this profound intellectual curiosity, which was rare for a warrior prince. He became obsessed with Homer's Iliad.
He viewed Achilles as his personal role model, didn't he? Carried an annotated copy on all his campaigns.
He did. And he could quote Euripides from memory. This education wasn't just philosophy. It was logic, medicine, moral instruction, elements that would later inform his unique style of governance.
And yet, despite all this intellectual promise, his relationship with his father was incredibly fraught. It was volatile.
Very. Alexander gained crucial military experience early, at 16, serving as regent while Philip was away campaigning. He successfully put down a Thracian revolt of the Maedi and even founded a city, Alexandropolis.
He also saved his father's life during the campaign against Perinthus.
And the peak of their shared military success was the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC. This was the moment Macedon decisively defeated the combined armies of Athens and Thebes.
Right, cementing control over the whole of Greece. Philip commanded the elite right wing.
But it was Alexander, leading the companion cavalry on the left, who achieved the breakthrough. He smashed the supposedly invincible Theban sacred band.
It was his definitive proof of military competence. But that success, it immediately led to political peril.
The succession crisis. It ignited when Philip married Cleopatra Eurydice.
She was a fully Macedonian noblewoman, the niece of General Attalus, and since Alexander's mother, Olympias, was from Epirus.
Any fully Macedonian son born to Cleopatra Eurydice would immediately threaten Alexander's claim to the throne. He was only half Macedonian, technically.
And that tension just exploded publicly at the wedding banquet.
Attalus, drunk, publicly toasted the couple, praying they produce a legitimate heir to the throne.
Which was a direct, calculated insult to Alexander's lineage.
Alexander's fury was immediate. He hurled a cup at Attalus and screamed something like, "What, am I then a bastard?"
And Philip, rising to defend his new wife's uncle, drew his sword and just stumbled. He fell flat on the floor, too drunk to even stand.
And here we see Alexander's sharp wit, even in a moment of mortal danger. As he fled the banquet, he famously mocked his father.
He said, "Look, the man who is preparing to cross from Europe to Asia cannot even cross from one couch to another."
This incident led to Alexander's temporary exile. He took his mother to Epirus, then went to live among the Illyrians, a group he'd recently subdued.
And while Philip clearly valued him too highly to permanently disown him, the rift was serious.
It was. Even after 6 months of mediation, the feud just popped right back up, leading to the exile of some of Alexander's key friends like Ptolemy and Harpalus.
This intense political instability really defined the final years of Philip's reign. It set the stage for the dramatic, immediate power vacuum that followed his assassination.
In October 336 BC, Philip was assassinated by his own bodyguard, Pausanias.
The motives are still contested. Personal slight, a conspiracy, maybe Persian involvement, but the result was instantaneous. Alexander, at age 20, was proclaimed king.
And the first test of his reign wasn't a battle, it was a house cleaning.
A ruthless one. The immediate consolidation of power was, well, it was brutal. How does this immediate display of political cruelty executing rivals like his cousin Amyntas of balance against the image of the enlightened student of Aristotle?
It really speaks to the absolute brutality of Macedonian politics. He simply could not afford a single challenger. The swift elimination of rivals was less about personal revenge and more about securing the Argid dynasty.
And his mother, Olympias, acted on her own, didn't she?
She did, and with horrifying zeal. She had Cleopatra Eurydice and her newborn daughter burned alive.
The sources claim Alexander was furious at his mother's excessive cruelty.
They do, but at the same time, he himself quickly ordered the assassination of General Attalus in Asia Minor. It was a clear move to neutralize a powerful, fully Macedonian general who might have championed a rival claimant to the throne.
So having secured his internal position, external threats immediately erupted.
Of course. News of Philip's death led to revolts all across Greece, especially in Thessaly, Thebes, and Athens. They all believed Macedonian power was decentralized and weak now.
And Alexander responded not with diplomacy, but with just astonishing speed.
He mustered 3,000 cavalry and rode south, only to find the Thessalians blocking the critical pass between Mount Olympus and Mount Ossa.
So instead of fighting through them, he just went around?
He went over them. He ordered his men to ride over the heavily forested slopes of Mount Ossa. The surprise was total. The Thessalians immediately submitted. It cemented his reputation for sheer audacity.
After securing the Peloponnese, we get that famous anecdote in Corinth where he meets Diogenes the Cynic.
The philosopher living in a tub, Alexander, intrigued, asks if there's anything he can do for him.
And Diogenes' famous reply was, yes, stand a little to the side, you're blocking the sunlight.
Alexander was delighted by this. He loved the philosopher's complete indifference to his power, saying, "But verily, if I were not Alexander, I would like to be Diogenes."
It shows that intellectual appreciation was still very much a part of his character, even while he was establishing total authority.
Absolutely. But before he could look east to Persia, he had to secure the northern frontier.
The Balkan campaign of 335 BC.
A strategic necessity, a move of deterrence. Philip had left the northern tribes semi-pacified, and Alexander needed absolute assurance that he wouldn't face a second front while he was campaigning deep in Asia.
He defeated the Thracians, crossed the massive Danube River by night in a bold maneuver, and then marched rapidly west to suppress an Illyrian revolt.
This campaign showed mobility and decisiveness on an immense scale. But the ultimate deterrent came when a false rumor spread in Greece.
That Alexander had been killed in Illyria.
Yes, which prompted Thebes to revolt again.
Alexander rushed back south, covering the distance in just 13 days. Thebes was besieged, and its fate became a brutal object lesson for all of Greece.
He razed the entire city, enslaved or massacred its population, and divided up the land. It was a shocking, completely disproportionate response.
The destruction of Thebes signaled in no uncertain terms that resistance to Macedonian authority was futile.
And that the era of independent Greek city-states was over. With Greece pacified and his general Antipater left as regent, Alexander was finally ready to take on the greatest power in the world, the Persian Empire.
So now Alexander adopts his father Philip's plan for a pan-Hellenic war against the Persians. It was initially framed as revenge for Xerxes' invasion centuries earlier.
But Alexander's ambition quickly turned this into a campaign of outright world conquest. He crossed the Hellespont in 334 BC, leading this massive multinational force.
Clearly 50,000 infantry and over 6,000 cavalry.
The logistics alone are breathtaking. But Alexander immediately defined his mission by throwing a spear into the Asian shore, dramatically claiming the continent as a divine gift.
This wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was a clear break from Philip's more cautious, preparation-heavy strategy. Alexander was claiming sovereignty, not just conducting a military raid.
Right. And the key to his rapid success wasn't just his audacious leadership, but the perfection of the Macedonian military machine. We have to understand the mechanics of this army.
It was the technological and tactical apex of its time.
It really was. The army operated on a hammer and anvil principle. The core was the infantry phalanx, armed with the deadly sarissa.
This massive pike, often 6 meters long, wielded with 2 hands, it created an impenetrable hedge of steel.
Terrifyingly effective, both defensively and offensively. These soldiers were the pejotyroi, the foot companions.
And they were supported by specialized units.
Crucially, yes. They were supported by the elite guards, the hypaspists, who were a lighter, more mobile connecting force. But the real striking power, the hammer, came from the heteroi, the companion cavalry.
Which Alexander himself typically led.
Always, these were heavily armed shock cavalry. So in battle, the phalanx would fix the enemy in place, the anvil, and Alexander would use the lightning-fast companion cavalry to maneuver around the flank and smash the enemy's command structure or rear ranks.
The Battle of the Granicus, his first victory in Asia Minor, demonstrated this perfectly.
It did. He used less than half his total force against the Persian satraps. Yet the speed of the companion cavalry charge, led by Alexander in person, shattered the Persians' formation. He secured a negligible loss victory and gained control of the entire coast of Asia Minor.
From there, we moved to the famous event at the Phrygian capital, Gordium, and the unsolvable Gordian knot.
Ah, yes. The prophecy declared that whoever undid the knot would become the king of Asia.
And this is a perfect example of Alexander turning a perceived restriction into a mandate for action.
Instead of painstakingly trying to untie the complex knot, he either sliced it in two with his sword, that's the popular account, or he pulled the peg that held the knot to the yoke pole, allowing him to unravel it.
The message was clear.
Absolutely. He created his own solution through decisive, immediate action. He fulfilled the prophecy on his own terms and cemented his image as the designated ruler of the continent.
This momentum carried him to the Battle of Issus in 333 BC, his first direct confrontation with Darius III, the king of Persia himself.
And although Darius commanded a massive, significantly larger army, Alexander managed to trap the Persian forces in a narrow coastal plain.
Which neutralized their numerical advantage.
Completely. And again, Alexander's personal command led the breakthrough. What defined this battle, though, was Darius's immediate flight.
He just fled, causing his entire army to dissolve in panic. He left behind his entire family, his wife, his mother Sisygambis, his daughters, and his incredible treasury.
So when Darius later offered a vast peace settlement, all the conquered lands plus a ransom of 10,000 talents for his family, Alexander's response was a masterclass in psychological warfare.
He just rejected the ransom out of hand.
He wrote back, stating that since he was now the king of Asia, it was he who dictated terms, not Darius. This move transitioned the conflict from a war of vengeance to a war of regime change. He wanted the whole thing.
Alexander then continued south, but he faced fierce resistance, most notably at the island city of Tyre in 332 BC.
That was a long, difficult 7-month siege. It forced Alexander to build a massive causeway connecting the island to the mainland.
The Tyre siege really reveals the extreme, uncompromising side of Alexander's generalship, doesn't it?
It does. It demonstrated his willingness to commit immense resources to achieve an objective, no matter the time or cost. And once captured, the severity of the punishment, the massacre of military-aged men, the enslavement of thousands, served as a brutal warning to any other coastal cities.
A similar, though shorter, siege followed at Gaza, where Alexander was actually wounded, which just underscores his personal risk-taking.
Yes, but after Tyre and Gaza, he moved into Egypt, and here he stopped being purely a conqueror.
He was immediately regarded as a liberator. The Persians had heavily oppressed and neglected the territory.
This was a crucial strategic pause. To legitimize his rule to the native Egyptians, he was crowned pharaoh in Memphis and focused on restoring temples and traditions. But the ultimate legitimizing move was his famous, arduous journey to the Oracle of Amun-Ra at the Siwa Oasis.
Why was that journey so strategically important?
Because the oracle pronounced him the son of the deity Amun. For the Egyptians, this was traditional. The pharaoh was considered a living god. For the Greeks, however, they interpreted this as a divine prophecy, confirming those earlier myths surrounding his birth.
The idea that Zeus-Ammon was his true father.
Exactly. This single act legitimized him to the local population while simultaneously inflating his already colossal image among his Greek subjects. His currency later depicted him with the horns of Ammon, a visible declaration of this claimed divinity.
And he also spent time founding the city of Alexandria, a strategically perfect location that would soon become the most prosperous and culturally vibrant city of the Hellenistic world.
A city that would last long past his own dynasty, but his ultimate objective remained Darius.
In early 331 BC, Alexander left Egypt, knowing he had to find and decisively eliminate the king of Persia.
That final confrontation came at the Battle of Gaugamela in Upper Mesopotamia. Darius commanded a force that some sources estimate was over 200,000 strong, including scythe chariots and war elephants.
Darius had learned from Issus. He chose a wide, open plain to maximize his numerical superiority.
He did, but Alexander's strategic brilliance shone through. He used a double phalanx formation, allowing the scythe chariots to pass harmlessly through the lines, which then just closed back up.
The ultimate move, though, was a feigned retreat on his right flank.
When Darius's cavalry moved to pursue the seemingly retreating Macedonians, a gap opened in the Persian center, allowing Alexander, leading the companion cavalry, to charge directly at Darius.
And for the third and final time, Darius fled the battlefield.
This secured the decisive victory, and with it, the entire Achaemenid Empire. Alexander proceeded to capture the major capitals, Babylon, Susa, and the ceremonial capital, Persepolis.
The entry into Babylon was recorded in astronomical diaries, noting the arrival of the king of the world, Alexander. Susa yielded an immense treasury, but Persepolis was different.
After defeating the defenders at the Persian gates, Alexander allowed his troops to loot the city for several days.
And this leads to the infamous destruction of Xerxes' palace. Was it calculated revenge, or just drunken folly?
The sources suggest a complex mix. It may have started as an accident during a celebratory drunken feast.
Or it could have been an intentional symbolic act of revenge for Xerxes burning the Acropolis in Athens centuries earlier.
Arrian suggests Alexander immediately regretted the act, or at least woke up the next morning regretting it. It really underscores this ongoing tension in Alexander's mind. Was he a pan-Hellenic avenger, or the new rightful king of Asia?
The end of the Achaemenid Empire was sealed when Darius, fleeing through Media and Parthia, was assassinated.
By his own kinsman and Bactrian satrap, Bessus, who then declared himself Artaxerxes V.
Alexander pursued the assassins relentlessly, and by giving Darius a regal funeral and executing Bessus for usurping authority, he explicitly claimed succession to the Achaemenid throne.
He positioned himself as the preserver of the Persian structure, merely swapping out the dynasty. This shift, however, came at a heavy cost to his relationship with the Macedonian Old Guard.
And this is where the internal friction truly begins. Alexander transitions from being the king of Macedon to the king of the world, and he starts trying to secure Iranian support by adopting Persian customs.
The shift was strategic but incredibly volatile. Alexander began wearing some elements of Persian dress, the purple robe, the diadem, and most disastrously, he introduced proskynesis at court.
Let's clarify what proskynesis meant and why it caused such an explosive reaction among the Greeks.
For the Persians, proskynesis was a gesture of deep respect. It involved kneeling or prostration, and it was appropriate when addressing a social superior or the great king, whom they viewed as semi-divine.
But for the Greeks, that was an act reserved only for the gods.
Exclusively. To perform proskynesis before Alexander was, in their view, an explicit acknowledgement of his divinity while he was still alive. This was not just a cultural misunderstanding, it was a political crisis.
His Macedonian and Greek peers saw it as a demand for deification and a repudiation of the Macedonian tradition of, free speech and camaraderie with the king.
It struck at the very heart of what it meant to be a Macedonian noble. Alexander eventually abandoned the practice after his historian, Callisthenes, who was Aristotle's nephew, publicly ridiculed the notion. But the damage was done.
This period really defines Alexander's increasing paranoia and impulsiveness.
The sources recount the execution of Philotas, one of his most senior officers, for failing to report a plot against the king, and the political fallout was immense.
The execution of Philotas necessitated the immediate preemptive assassination of his father, Parmenion.
Parmenion, who had been Philip's great general, was commander of the reserves, and he was guarding the vast treasury at Ecbatana. Alexander feared Parmenion's reaction to his son's death. This entire affair is the clearest indicator that Alexander was starting to lose trust in his most loyal Macedonian companions.
And then there's the famous tragic episode with Cleitus the Black, the man who had saved his life at the Battle of the Granicus.
During a drunken banquet at Mariconda, the tension between Alexander's adopted Eastern persona and the Macedonian Old Guard finally just snapped.
Cleitus, infuriated by Alexander's praise of Persian bravery over Macedonian sacrifice, drunkenly accused Alexander of forgetting his father and adopting a corrupt Oriental lifestyle.
Alexander, in a fit of impulsive rage, grabbed a spear and killed Clytus instantly. It's reported that he was immediately consumed by remorse, refusing food and drink for days. This incident highlights the psychological fragility beneath the conquering persona.
A man constantly warring between his intellect and his temper.
And the paranoia continued. Callisthenes, the historian who opposed proskynesis, was implicated in a subsequent plot by royal pages. Whether he was truly involved or just a victim of Alexander's resentment is debated.
But he was tortured and died, removing the king's official chronicler.
It's clear that by the time Alexander finished his Central Asian campaign, marrying the local Sogdian noblewoman Roxana to stabilize his new eastern satrapies, the cost of conquest was being tallied not just in territory gained, but in broken loyalties and psychological strain.
So the Indian campaign. This represented the final geographical push of his ambition.
It began relatively smoothly. The ruler of Taxila, Amphis, submitted willingly, aiding the Macedonian army with provisions and bridge construction over the Indus.
But the terrain and resistance quickly became ferocious. He faced fierce opposition from hill clans, the Aspazioi and Asakanoi, which required brutal siege warfare.
And we see the return of Alexander's personal risk-taking. He was wounded in the shoulder by a dart, and his uncompromising nature, reducing strongholds like Massaga to rubble and slaughtering the inhabitants.
The ultimate test in India came at the Battle of the Hydaspes in 326 BC against King Porus.
Right, who ruled the region between the Hydaspes and Chenab rivers. And this was the first time Alexander's army faced a large, coordinated force that was relying heavily on war elephants.
He was a true tactical masterpiece. Alexander knew a direct confrontation would be a disaster.
So he used a ruse. He repeatedly marched and countermarched along the river, feigning crossings until Porus relaxed his guard. Then Alexander executed a risky night, crossing several miles upstream in a driving rainstorm, splitting his forces brilliantly.
But how did the Macedonian army, trained for phalanx combat, cope with these terrifying war elephants?
Alexander instructed his men to maintain open ranks. Let the elephants charge through rather than trying to stop them head-on.
And once they were through?
The sarissa proved lethal. The infantry could surround and harass the elephants, stabbing upwards at the handlers and at their flanks. Despite heavy losses, Alexander's tactical flexibility secured the victory.
And Alexander, famously impressed by Porus's bravery, not only spared him but made him an ally, and even added territory to his rule.
It shows he could still recognize and reward greatness even in an enemy. And following the battle, he founded 2 cities, Bucephala for his beloved horse who died, and Nicaea for victory.
But this marks the high point, and it's quickly followed by the great turning point, the mutiny at the Hyphasis River.
The modern Bees River.
East of Porus's kingdom lay the massive Nanda Empire of Agada, and Alexander's troops had heard terrifying reports. An army with 80,000 horsemen, 200,000 infantry, and 6,000 war elephants. Why did this specific threat finally break the will of an army that had defeated Darius 3 times?
It wasn't just the enemy's size, it was logistical exhaustion, compounded by years of campaigning in completely unfamiliar and hostile terrain, often fighting during the monsoon season.
They had been campaigning for 8 years. They were pushing the limits of the known world. They genuinely believed they were marching off the edge of the map.
They were battle-hardened, yes, but they deeply longed for home, their families, and the life they had left behind. They were done.
Alexander, despite resorting to pleas, threats, and attempts to appeal to their sense of Homeric glory, just could not sway them.
No. His general, Coenus, spoke for the troops, pleading for Alexander to consider their suffering and homesickness.
It was a remarkable moment. Alexander, the absolute ruler, was forced to concede to the will of his own troops.
He eventually agreed to turn back, commissioning the construction of 12 massive altars to mark the easternmost extent of his conquest.
The journey home, however, was as destructive as any battle. Alexander led the army south along the Indus, where he suffered a near-fatal wound while conquering the Malian citadel.
An arrow pierced his lung. His life hung in the balance for days.
This near-death experience must have deeply affected his generals. The entire empire depended on this singular mortal man.
Had he died there, the disintegration would have begun instantly. The subsequent return was brutal. Alexander split his forces. He sent the bulk of the army on a separate, safer route with Craterus.
He, however, led the remaining men through the desolate Gedrosian desert and Makron.
And sources suggest thousands were lost during this harsh desert march, not to battle, but to starvation, thirst, and logistical failure. It was a punishing return.
When he finally reached Susa in 324 BC, he was in a mood for reckoning, a period often called the Reign of Terror.
He executed several misbehaving satraps and governors who had abused their authority during his long absence. He sent a clear, ruthless message about the limits of their autonomy.
But the tension between Alexander and his Macedonians was still raw, and it culminated in the mutiny at Opus.
This mutiny stemmed from two primary issues: his continued adoption of Persian customs and his attempt to integrate Persian soldiers into Macedonian units. When Alexander tried to dismiss overaged Macedonian veterans, the army saw it as an attempt to purge the old guard.
And replace them with Persians.
Exactly. They protested furiously, demanding that Alexander send all Macedonians home, leaving him to campaign with his father, Ammon.
Alexander retreated for 3 days, refusing to see anyone.
He then appeared, surrounded by Persian bodyguards, and gave this powerful speech highlighting Macedonian ingratitude. He announced he would just register all Persian troops as companions.
The threat worked.
It did. The Macedonians, fearing they would be replaced, submitted. Alexander conceded, holding a massive reconciliation banquet, sharing a cup with thousands of men.
Following this, he attempted to solidify his policy of cultural harmonization through the grand spectacle of the Susa marriages,
Where 90 of his senior officers, including himself, married Persian noblewomen.
The intention was profound: to create loyalties through biological ties, blending the Macedonian aristocracy with the Persian nobility. Alexander himself married Stachiera, Darius III's daughter.
But the policy was a failure. Few of these arranged marriages lasted beyond a year after his death. It highlighted that cultural integration couldn't be imposed through royal decree alone.
His final decline was marked by the death of his closest friend, general, and presumed lover, Hephaestion, in Ecbatana.
Hephaestion's death, possibly from a sudden illness or poisoning, absolutely devastated Alexander. He ordered unprecedented mourning, demolishing a temple, and commissioning a colossal, expensive funeral pyre in Babylon. This grief contributed immensely to his decline.
Even in Babylon, his mind was still working on global concepts. Diodorus recorded detailed written instructions, his last plans.
And these plans revealed the scale of his grandiosity. They included building 1,000 ships larger than any standard warship, massive temples across Greece, and a monumental tomb for Philip.
Most provocatively, he planned invasion of Arabia and the circumnavigation of Africa.
But the most ambitious, arguably globalist project was the amalgamation of populations. The transplant of populations from Asia to Europe and vice versa, intended to forge a common unity.
This vision was centuries ahead of its time.
But it was deemed completely impractical and extravagantly expensive by his generals, the Diadochi. After Alexander's death, Perdiccas read the notebooks to the assembled troops, who overwhelmingly voted not to carry them out. They knew they were impossible to fulfill.
And this brings us to the ultimate uncertainty: Alexander's death in Babylon at age 32, in June of 323 BC. The circumstances remain one of history's greatest mysteries.
We have two primary conflicting accounts of his final days. Plutarch describes a gradual 14-day illness starting after a heavy drinking session, with high fever and pain.
And Diodorus, however, suggests a sudden, violent onset of pain after he drank a large bowl of unmixed wine.
And that discrepancy fuels the two major theories: poison or natural causes.
Given the political climate, the poison theory gained immediate traction.
Diodorus, Plutarch, and Arrian all mention it. Suspicion fell heavily on Antipater, who had recently been removed as viceroy of Macedon. He was suspected of using his son, Iollas, Alexander's cupbearer, to administer a subtle poison.
The issue historically challenging this theory is the long duration of the illness, 12 days. Most ancient poisons were fast-acting.
True, but modern theories suggest certain slow-acting substances, like white hellebore derived from a toxic plant, can mimic the symptoms described in the sources: fever, nausea, weakness, and eventual collapse.
On the other hand, natural causes are highly plausible.
Very. Alexander was severely weakened by years of heavy drinking, numerous severe wounds, including that near-fatal lung injury, and the immense psychological stress following Hephaestion's death.
Suggested natural illnesses include things like typhoid fever, malaria, even acute pancreatitis.
Regardless of the cause, his death created immediate political chaos. When asked who should inherit the kingdom, Alexander's final words were recorded as toi kratistoi,
To the strongest.
or possibly a mishearing of toi krateroi to Craterus, the general leading the veterans home. but the interpretation to the strongest set the stage for total anarchy. He passed his signet ring to his most trusted bodyguard, Perdiccas.
But a signet ring is not a line of succession. Alexander had no legitimate adult heir. His son, by Roxana, Alexander IV, was born posthumously.
So the generals, the Diadochi, initially tried to maintain a facade of unity. They proclaimed the infant Alexander IV and Alexander's mentally disabled half-brother Philip III as joint kings.
That unity lasted mere minutes. The generals immediately began treating their assigned territories, Egypt for Ptolemy, the East for Seleucus, as personal kingdoms.
The Athenian orator Demades famously remarked that the Macedonian army without Alexander was like the blinded Cyclops making random and disorderly movements.
And the ultimate sign of this immediate collapse was the struggle over Alexander's body.
Ptolemy, realizing the powerful propaganda value of possessing the corpse of the conquering god, seized the funeral cortege and diverted the body to Egypt, establishing the legitimacy of the Ptolemaic dynasty in Alexandria.
This rivalry spiraled into 40 years of brutal, chaotic war among the Diadochi. The final result was the dissolution of his singular empire into three major Hellenistic kingdoms: the Ptolemaic, the Seleucid, and the Antigonid.
The empire, built in 12 years, fractured instantly upon the death of its single controlling authority.
The death of Alexander and the subsequent consolidation of his fractured empire marks the conventional start of the Hellenistic period.
It's a massive cultural and political shift that defined the next 3 centuries. This phenomenon, which historian Johann Gustav Droysen dubbed Hellenization, refers to the spread of Greek culture, language, and population across the former Persian Empire.
It wasn't just a surface layer. It led to the universal adoption of Koine Greek as the lingua franca, the common language of trade, scholarship, even the New Testament.
Right across that vast region. And Alexander left his mark quite literally, founding over 20 cities named Alexandria. Alexandria, Egypt, of course, became the most prominent, known for its massive library and intellectual institutions.
These cities served a dual purpose, right? They were military garrisons and key nodes for trade.
Crucially, they were centers of Greek culture, with gymnasia, theaters, and Greek forms of government. Over time, these cities successfully fused Greek and local populations, leading to genuinely cosmopolitan centers. We have archaeological proof of his investment in their Hellenic identity.
The most remarkable example of this cultural exchange, though, occurred in Central and South Asia.
This is where we see true syncretism. With the rise of the Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek kingdoms, Hellenistic traditions blended profoundly with local Iranian culture, and critically, with Buddhism.
This created Greco-Buddhism, the Gandharan style of art. For the first time, the Buddha was depicted figuratively.
And he was often modeled on the idealized human form of Greek statues, perhaps specifically derived from the youthful Greek Apollo. It's an incredible fusion.
And the political and philosophical impact was just as deep.
Absolutely. We see it in the East with King Menander I, a Greek king who became immortalized in Buddhist texts as Melinda, a philosopher king who may have converted to the religion.
And his legacy was equally powerful in the West, particularly in Rome, where he served as the ultimate military role model for centuries.
Roman generals were obsessed with him. Pompey the Great adopted the epithet Magnus and famously styled his hair to mirror Alexander. Julius Caesar, visiting Alexander's tomb, reportedly wept when he realized he had accomplished comparatively little by Alexander's age.
It wasn't just admiration. It was a psychological yardstick by which all subsequent Western conquerors measured themselves.
And that admiration sometimes devolved into outright mania, particularly with the Emperor Caracalla in the 3rd century AD.
Caracalla was convinced he was Alexander reincarnated. His obsession led him to execute Aristotelian philosophers, believing Aristotle was involved in poisoning Alexander.
He even commanded 16,000 of his own men to be arrayed in Macedonian-style phalanxes for parades, physically attempting to resurrect the Macedonian military past.
And yet, despite this role model status, Roman writers also used Alexander as a cautionary tale, a tragic example of what happens when autocratic tendencies and boundless ambition become divorced from reason.
Which leads to the enduring literary legacy. Alexander's exploits were quickly mythologized, coalescing into the 3rd century text known as the Alexander Romance.
Though it was falsely attributed to his historian Callisthenes, this collection of fantastical tales became immensely popular.
It was translated into dozens of languages and became one of the most widely circulated texts in the pre-modern world, second only to the Bible in European popularity. It completely distorted his historical reality, transforming him into a mythical figure.
And this fantastical view influenced his portrayal across different cultures.
It did. In Zoroastrian Persia, he was often labeled Gujastak, or accursed, for the destruction he inflicted. Yet in the Islamic tradition, influenced by the Romance, he appears positively in the Iskandarnama, sometimes seen as a righteous Shah, or the mythical figure Du al-Qarnayn, the two-horned one, who seeks the fountain of immortality.
In modern Greece, he remains this pervasive figure, Alexandros, a source of national pride and mythology.
All these diverse narratives, though, bring us back to the original challenge we faced: historiography. We must reiterate that all texts written by his contemporaries are lost. We are reliant on the later accounts.
And the reliability varies drastically. While Curtius, Rufus, Plutarch, and Justin provide valuable anecdotes, Arrian is generally considered the most reliable.
Precisely because he explicitly based his work on the lost accounts of Alexander's own generals, Ptolemy and Aristobulus.
But even using Ptolemy presents a challenge, doesn't it?
A huge one. Ptolemy was writing his own history of the campaign after he became the pharaoh of Egypt. Modern historians recognize he undoubtedly molded events to cast himself in the most favorable light, enhancing his own role and perhaps justifying his later actions.
The task of separating the historical facts of Alexander's unprecedented genius from the self-serving legend he and his successors helped create is, well, it's an eternal one.
It really is.
What a profound and complex deep dive. We have tracked Alexander from his tumultuous upbringing under Philip and Aristotle, through the ruthless consolidation of his power, to the strategic military mastery that shattered an empire.
We've seen the immense psychological toll this process took on the man, leading to paranoia and impulsive violence, culminating in the mutiny and his early mysterious death.
And the legacy, as we've established, is intensely paradoxical. Unprecedented military success led to the vast cultural transformation of the Hellenistic world.
Yet that empire, which was supposed to be his great enduring achievement, immediately collapsed into 40 years of brutal warfare among his generals.
And that contrast, the genius who built and the fragility that followed, is what we want to leave you, the listener, with to mull over. Alexander was perhaps history's first truly globalist thinker.
He was aiming for world unity, founding over 20 cities, and planning the literal transplantation of populations between Europe and Asia to forge a single, harmonious culture.
Yet, that entire project of cultural construction and unification was so reliant on his singular mortal power
That the destruction he caused to achieve it was immediately mirrored by the destruction of the wars of the Diadochi the moment he died.
So if the goal was unity, why did the execution rely so completely on one man's life? Was the empire always destined to fragment, proving that unity imposed by the sword is, by its very nature, fleeting?
A question that defined the ancient world, and one that remains relevant to understanding power and transition even today.
That is all the time we have for this deep dive.